Welcome to The Explainer. Today we are diving deep into a massive 150-year historical arc around what's often called India's absolute biggest internal security threat. We're talking about Naxalism. We're going to track how a philosophical idea, literally pinned over in Europe, somehow morphed into this massive, armed insurgency right across the Indian subcontinent.
It's a pretty staggering question when you really sit down and think about it. How in the world does a highly localized dispute, over a single patch of farmland in one remote village, escalate to the point where it encompasses literally 40% of a massive nation's landmass? Well, let's unpack exactly how that happened. Here is our roadmap to understand this whole life cycle. We'll hit the seeds of a revolution, the Naxalbari spark, rise of the Red Corridor, corporate wealth and tribal grievances, peak and parallel governments, and finally, the fall and future. All right, Section 1, Seeds of a Revolution, from Europe to India. First things first, we need to trace the global roots that eventually planted themselves in Indian soil. It's kind of a crazy domino effect, really. It starts with Karl Marx back in 1848 publishing the Communist Manifesto as a reaction to all that industrial exploitation in Europe. He's proposing a classless society, right? And arguing that the ruling class is never going to give up power peacefully, which puts armed struggle squarely on the table. Fast forward, and this framework inspires Vladimir Lenin's successful Russian Revolution in 1917, which, by the way, deeply alarmed the British in India. By 1925, the Communist Party of India, or CPI, was officially launched. And then, the massive catalyst hits in 1949. Mao Zedong establishes Communist China through this violent guerrilla war led by peasant farmers. For radical thinkers in India, this was it. It gave them a direct, real-world blueprint for how a farming-based economy could actually pull off an armed revolution. Now, to put that into perspective, look at the reality in India at the time. The zamindari system was, frankly, brutally exploitative. Imagine you were doing all the back-breaking labor in the fields, right? But the local zamindars take 50% of your crop right off the top, and the British take 90% of that share. You are left with virtually nothing. So stacked up against that grim reality, the communist promise of giving the land to the tiller and fighting for genuine equality, well, that sounded absolutely incredible to a deeply frustrated rural population. Moving on to Section 2, the Naxalbari spark. Let's zero in on the exact catalyst that gave this whole movement its name. This is absolutely crucial because a single, tragic story ended up acting as a massive flashpoint. It's 1967 in the West Bengal village of Naxalbari. A tribal farmer named Bhimo Kisan did everything right. He went through the courts and actually won his land rights in the Supreme Court. But the local zamindar's men totally ignored the ruling, beat him up, and drove him off his land anyway. And when the police did nothing, local CPI leaders stepped in and armed 150 tribals to seize the crops back. This escalated super fast into a vicious cycle of violence. A police inspector was killed by arrows, the police retaliated by firing on the villagers, and 11 people died. For radical communist leaders watching this, it was definitive proof. It proved the legal system was utterly failing the poor, and armed uprising was literally the only path forward. So, the source details that the chaotic events in this one single village coined the term Naxalism. Because it's so closely mirrored Maoist tactics over in China, you'll also hear it called Maoism. Now, this ideology wasn't just random anger. It was heavily structured and pushed by a radical leader named Charu Majumdar. He had been writing what became known as the historic 8 documents. These documents basically served as a step-by-step DIY manual on how to use primitive weapons to attack landlords and police, all with the ultimate goal of capturing state power. Now, you have to understand this ideological split. It's a real fork in the road. The mainstream CPI, they chose the ballot box. They participated in democratic elections and actually went on to become the main opposition party. But Charu Majumdar, he chose the bullet. Believing that true power only comes from the barrel of a gun, he formed a completely breakaway faction, the CPI-ML, or Marxist-Leninist. This new group completely boycotted elections and fully embraced a Mao-style armed revolution, which kicked off a really brutal wave of violence across states like West Bengal, Bihar, and Andhra Pradesh. Okay, Section 3, Rise of the Red Corridor. Moving into the 1980s, we see how this ideology shifts into a highly organized insurgency. Here is the thing. During the 1970s, the state cracked down hard. Charu Majumdar died in police custody, and thousands of his followers were locked up during the 1975 emergency. So you really have to ask yourself, how on earth did a movement that was essentially squashed down to zero manage to resurrect itself as an even bigger threat just a decade later? Well, the answer is hiding deep in India's forests. It's tied to a man named Kondapalli Sitaramaya and his newly formed People's War Group. See, after getting out of jail, instead of trying to fight in the regular villages, they retreated into these dense forest areas. These were places where millions of tribal people lived completely disconnected from modern infrastructure, and the insurgents won their trust by fighting local exploitation. For example, take tendu leaves, which are used to make beedis. Contractors were paying the tribals a measly 4 rupees for 100 bundles. The Naxals stepped in and forcefully demanded that price be hiked up to 25 rupees. Think about that. That is a massive overnight wage increase. By delivering this kind of rough justice and actually fixing real economic issues, they won incredibly fierce local loyalty.
Which brings us to a huge turning point. Section 4. Corporate Wealth and Tribal Grievance, the 1991 Shift.
According to the history we're tracking, the 1991 economic reforms opened India's markets up to private corporations. But there was a massive geographical collision here. 85% of India's coal, along with a ton of other valuable minerals, lay directly beneath the dense forests where the tribals lived. As these private companies flooded in, the government often bypassed constitutional protections that were specifically designed to safeguard tribal lands. And even when the courts actually ruled in favor of the tribals, loopholes were used to grant mining access anyway. So, feeling completely alienated and threatened with losing their homes and their livelihoods, the tribals overwhelmingly turned to the Naxal insurgents for protection. This handed the movement a massive wave of very angry, very motivated recruits.
Now we're looking at the conflict at its absolute height. Section 5, Peak and Parallel Governments. This covers roughly 2005 to 2010.
Just take a second to look at the sheer scale here. At its peak around 2010, the newly united CPI Maoist group held sway over more than 180 districts. They essentially controlled a staggering 40% of India's entire landmass. They carved out this massive red corridor that just stretched across multiple states.
And here's the crazy part. The Naxals weren't just hiding out in the woods anymore. They had the audacity to set up and run a highly structured parallel government called the Janatha Sarkar, or People's Government. They ran their own courts to settle land and marriage disputes, they set up seed banks, movable schools, and this really organized tax extortion system targeting contractors, shopkeepers, and mining companies. They became so incredibly powerful that they literally forced massive corporations to abandon billion-dollar projects. Tata Motors had to pack up a major car plant in West Bengal, costing thousands of jobs. South Korea's POSCO completely walked away from a $12 billion steel plant in Odisha. And heavily equipped with advanced IEDs and military-grade mines, they were pulling off deadly coordinated attacks on police forces and even trying to assassinate high-ranking politicians.
Finally, Section 6. The Fall and Future. How does a force controlling 40% of the country begin to just rapidly collapse?
Well, the collapse was basically a two-pronged thing. First, there was massive internal rot. The top leadership, who were mostly from dominant castes, started hoarding wealth. We're talking buying luxury flats in Delhi and paying huge bribes to get their relatives into private medical colleges. Meanwhile, they were reportedly forcing their own tribal foot soldiers to undergo vasectomies so they wouldn't have families to distract them. Obviously, this blatant hypocrisy totally alienated their base. Simultaneously, the state completely modernized its strategy. They upgraded the CRPF with helicopters and advanced tech, the National Investigation Agency went aggressively after the Maoists' financial networks, and the government finally started heavily investing in real infrastructure and jobs right in those tribal areas.
Our source also notes a crucial strategic shift right in the middle of this decline. The government figured out the insurgents were getting a lot of help from the cities, and they cracked down hard on what they termed urban Naxals. Now, these are intellectual sympathizers, certain lawyers, professors, and NGO workers who were accused of providing legal loopholes, funding, and logistical shelter for the armed cadres hiding out in the forests. The government ended up banning 74 front organizations, which just crippled the movement's support system. And when demonetization hit, it completely devastated the Naxals' cash-based extortion economy.
The results of this multi-front strategy, combining surrender policies, intense military pressure, cutting off urban funding, and bringing in actual rural development, have been dramatic. Naxal influence has absolutely plummeted from over 180 districts at its peak, all the way down to roughly 18 today.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. The government has openly vowed to eradicate Naxalism entirely by 2026. But as long as the echoes of Bimal Kisan's original struggle remain, that fundamental fight for fair land rights and dignity for the poorest farmers, will the physical end of the Naxal insurgency truly mean the end of the rebellion? Or will those underlying grievances simply find a new name?
Thanks so much for joining me today, and keep questioning the history behind the headlines.